Sarah Parshall Perry is standing by to talk about this very problem. It's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Vicki, I love doing your show, not the least of which is you have great music, and you start your program with Sweet Child of Mine. So I am also a fan of 80s music.
Yes. Yes. I should point out you're the vice president and legal fellow at Defending Education. And so this issue of the First Amendment, if we don't get this right, we don't get anything right. So if we don't get this right, then just yesterday I had a story about a man who was fired from his job for just having a conversation about how his biblical Christian values don't permit him from agreeing that there are more than two genders. Okay. He gets fired from his job for doing that. And if we don't get this First Amendment thing right, then a whole bunch of people are going to say, well, he should have said those people, he should have agreed that there are more than one. That's inclusive. We already have people making that argument. And now you've got generations of young people learning that constraint of free speech is an important thing the government should do.
Yeah, it's incredibly problematic. And listen, the problem here is that we've got a lot of federal judges backing up a lot of bad decisions by school administrators and officials. We saw a young man make it all the way to the Supreme Court in a case called LM versus Middleborough. And just yesterday, the Supreme Court declined to hear his case. This is a young man, middle school student in Massachusetts, wore a T-shirt that said simply, there are only two genders. They sent him home, school officials claiming that what he was wearing was going to be disruptive to the school environment, when, of course, there was no factual record, no factual evidence in the trial record that, in fact, it was disruptive to the students. He came back the next day, wore a T-shirt that said there are only two censored genders, and was sent home again. It took him more than 18 months to make it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court yesterday declined to hear his free speech case. This was disheartening, and in a 14-page opinion dissenting from denial of review, Justice Alito, joined by Justice Thomas, basically called the court cowards. He said the case presented an issue of great importance for our nation's youth, whether, quote, public schools can suppress student speech, either because it expresses a viewpoint that the school disfavors or because of vague concerns on the likely effect of speech on a school atmosphere. Well, there's no constitutional right to be free of offense. There is no constitutional right of American kids to be shielded from ideas with which they may disagree. And yet, 3 federal judges seem to have found that to be the actual case. Right. That young man's case, unfortunately, won't be heard by the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so that lower court decision stands, that it's okay to censor that kid. And this idea that somehow saying there are 72 genders is inclusive, but saying there are 2 is non-inclusive. Saying there are 72 is, I mean, it's a political statement. The gender ideology is gender politics. So it is a political statement. He was engaged in the most important kind of free speech. Maybe not the most important. You could argue religious speech. I don't think we should put it on a scale here. I think they're equally important. That he was engaging in a public debate. It wasn't just because someone doesn't like his opinion doesn't make it disruptive. That's we have another example, and I think this is even more egregious myself. This is a case of parents who wore wristbands when their daughter, essentially to say, I support girls and girls sports. And the wristbands were pink wristbands. The wristbands had 2 X's on them for the X chromosomes. And it was a declaration that they disagreed with putting boys in girls sports. Someone please argue with me and tell me that we have solved this problem, that there is no debate about this. But they were told it was non-inclusive to stand up for girls and girls sports. And so
That's exactly it.
Found themselves removed from the events. And I'm not sure where that case stands at this particular point. It's kind of fresh.
Well, actually, that's exactly it. I mean, the ink is barely dry on what the lower court determined in New Hampshire. This is an opinion by Judge Stephen McAuliffe. He ruled that public school officials had not violated those parents' First Amendment rights when it ejected them, not asked them to change, not asked them to sit in a certain area, ejected them from their own daughter's soccer game for silently wearing XX symbols in opposition to the biological boy against whom their daughters were competing. Listen, that school game was what's called a limited public forum. You can speak. If you allow individuals to come in publicly, anybody from the public can come into that environment. They are allowed to speak whatever individual message they want to communicate. And in fact, I think this, to me, the height of viewpoint discrimination is the superintendent of schools said she would ban the XX wristband, but she would not ban a pride symbol. When she was asked why, she said, well, considering one over the other, one is inclusive and one makes the others feel targeted or harassed. Why? Because you're representing biologically accurate chromosomal representation.
Pride's not inclusive.
On a wristband.
Pride's not inclusive. I'm so tired of this. Pride flags are not inclusive. Pride flags say if you are a heteronormative, cisgender white person who believes in two genders, you're a bigot. You're a racist. You're not welcome. You're not allowed. You're not allowed to speak. You're not allowed to think that way. You're not allowed to even be around. So this idea that that's inclusive, this is what the courts need to rein in. But where does this idiot thinking come from, Sarah? Because this is ubiquitous across schools. You can find this probably in every single Wisconsin school. We're constantly fighting those kinds of battles here. Some kid wears a T-shirt that's got the Glock symbol on it. He gets booted out or whatever it might be.
Right.
This is so we've already raised multiple generations who did not come out of K-12 with a value of free speech in the first place.
That's it. That's it. And listen, the Supreme Court has said over and over and over again, the most recent case was the Kennedy versus Bremerton case. If you remember the case of the kneeling coach, the coach who was praying at the 50-yard line quietly after the game was over, when the clock had stopped and people were filtering out of the stands. The Supreme Court said very clearly, Justice Gorsuch wrote that opinion, and he said the value of American pluralism requires that we protect and defend ideas, because even the unpopular ones, and especially the unpopular ones, are in more need of protection than popular ones. Listen, it's not popular to go against the flow, but quite frankly, I don't have a problem with your speech. There should be no attempt to stifle mine if we are both given access to the same public environment. We know that old quote that's been wrongly attributed to Voltaire. It was actually Evelyn Beatrice Hall who wrote it, but I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, is no longer applicable in American public education because we have raised a generation of victimized children who have been taught to see people as victims and victors and oppressed and oppressors. Yes. And when you create a culture of microaggressed victims, you eliminate their capability to deal with the world on Front Street and to be steel-spined in representation of what they believe, but in also mutual appreciation for the right of another person to say what they believe. That is a lost value in American education.
Right. And, nobody was disrupted in any of these things we're talking about. It didn't, nobody went home and beat their children because a coach prayed on a field or because a parent wore a XX wristband or because a kid wore a T-shirt to school. But where does it lead? This is the thing. It leads to really dark places. It leads to anti-Semitism. It leads to racism. It leads to the justification of denial of equal protection under the law. It leads, I don't want to say the G word, but it leads to genocide. It's when you unwind this whole snarled, ball of yarn, it leads to the justification of killing people because of what they believe or don't believe.
That's exactly it. Because, again, you perpetuated the mindset of victim, victor, oppressed, and oppressor. And when you eliminate the capability to openly exchange ideas on a level footing, everyone's basis, everyone's beliefs, everyone's perspective can and should constitutionally be heard in a public forum, like a public school, like a public event. The problem is when we begin to act upon the idea that some ideas are good and some ideas are bad, and we will effectuate violence, marginalization, polarization, targeting because of those particular ideas, we've crossed over into federal statutory violations. That's what we're seeing perpetuate on college campuses right now with exactly what you said, the same type of anti-Semitism, the same type of DEI garbage that, again, is just fomenting narratives upon which people are acting violently. We're seeing it right now in Seattle, when we saw a number of worshipers go to a public park to hold an event for which they legally had a permit, and they were shut down by violent Antifa and Trantifa activists, many of whom had to be dragged away in handcuffs for their violent antics. These are moms and dads with young children who were at a praise and worship rally, and they're surrounded by violent activists who cannot abide that someone else thinks differently than they do, so they're willing to act with violence upon it.
And unfortunately, in that Seattle situation, this is true in a lot of these, the police, essentially let it happen. They'll take one or two people and they'll say, these are the worst actors. This person threw a block of concrete or whatever that might be. But I saw the crowd surround the mom with the baby, and nobody did anything to help her. No one did anything to help her. So that's the next step, is that, if you think back to the civil rights movement, and you had very brave police officers, maybe they didn't even agree with Martin Luther King Jr., but they were willing to protect the children or the parents who were, as the schools were being integrated. That you don't have that anymore. If there is a minority being picked on, and I mean a minority, so let's just think of a group here, not necessarily a defined minority under postmodern politics, but a small group of Christians going to a park to have a rally, a small group of Jewish kids on campus with Israel flags, fighting against the anti-Semitism, a small group of parents going to a school board meeting to stand up for their daughter's rights to be free from, naked boys in the locker room. You don't see the law enforcement typically help those minorities in those particular instances. So that's where we are in this country. You've taught at least one generation, maybe two generations of people to say it's okay to discriminate. It's okay to be a bigot. It's okay to be a racist. It's okay to be an anti-Semite. It's okay to be, a religious bigot, whatever. And how do we undo it, Sarah? That's the question. The Supreme Court has been pretty good, but it hasn't changed anything.
Well, that's exactly it. And, I've told a lot of people, the judiciary, the federal judiciary, and particularly after President Trump's appointment of a number of really good federal judges and 3 good Supreme Court picks. We can sort of quibble on Amy Coney Barrett. I think she's surprised a lot of conservatives because she's really turned out to be more of a moderate. But as far as the First Amendment is concerned, they have been pretty much right down the sticks on supporting, protecting, enhancing free speech rights, particularly so within public education. I am surprised that they did not take up the Ellen versus Middleborough case. But unfortunately, where we are now, and until we can claw back a lot of this garbage in public education, we have the federal judiciary, and thank God now the Department of Justice, to root out civil rights violations that are being perpetuated under the guise of, well, this is our freedom of speech. Well, no, race discrimination, ethnicity discrimination, national origin discrimination, those are actually violations of federal statutory law. So we've got to see consistency between, are you allowed to speak? Yes. Are you going to trample on someone else's civil rights? No. And until we get all of the other universities, especially so with Harvard at the helm, who is perpetuating unapologetically race discrimination, including more than a century of anti-Semitism, we're not going to see a change. So it's got to start with the individuals who are in the educational institutions right now.
Yeah, Harvard, the hotbed of anti-Semitism, and it is. It's the Department of Justice launching civil rights investigations and then handing down consent decrees, plus a denial of federal funding from the Department of Education. That's going to be something that they're just going to have to be really aggressive on. We can also, obviously you have to fight. We didn't even really try that hard to fight for superintendents' positions and to have more control over education, as you see happening in states like Oklahoma, which is, you've got a really tough guy there who's trying to fight like hell just to get some basic constitutional education going on. But the DOJ and the DOE at the federal level are very, very important. It's how we got this mess in the first place. Consent decrees based on Dear Colleague letters, school districts caved, fearing the Obama administration, make them fear the Trump administration, right? That's what I think.
It.
I mean, it makes sense.
That's exactly it.